Hello and welcome in this new podcast of the Hague Peace Projects called Peace in Ukraine, Time to Talk. This is actually the first interview that we do in English. As you know from us, if you've been following us, we do usually interviews in Dutch. But we want to widen our scope, and today, therefore, I'm very happy to talk to Amir Kiyaei. If I pronounce it well, I don't know.
Perfectly.
Thank you very much. Who works for a political movement called DiEm25, and they take a stance also as a political organization with regards to the war in Ukraine. And I'm very curious to hear about what DiEm25 stands for as a party, and also what they suggest as potential solutions for the conflict that's currently going on.
Mm-hmm.
But first, Amir, can I ask you about yourself? Who are you, and what's your role in the party?
Sure. Thank you very much, Jakob. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an honor to be having this interview with you. I've seen your work maybe from a distance, if you will, and I hope to get to experience the Hague Peace Project as well in person. You're doing great work, bringing people of diaspora together towards the goal of peace, which is a very critical goal, especially now, since we're on a really or nervously on the brink of a larger scale war on Europe and even beyond. And we've seen the ramifications as well in West Africa as the global system starts to unravel. But that's maybe later for the interview.
Yes,
Let me
first maybe before so yourself, maybe because of course we've come across you because of the political movement that you're part of. Can you first maybe tell a little bit about the movement? Where does it come from, and what does it stand for?
Sure. DiEm25 normally stands for Democracy in Europe Movement. 25 was founded in 2016, predominantly as a response to the crisis, the financial crisis that have been happening in this past decades in Europe,
yes.
As well as the crisis of democracy that's actually is facing Europe, especially with at that period of time on the back of the Greek referendum, where the Greek people voted against the financial plan, and which was just overruled.
Forced through.
It was forced through. So the popular will was not just the sovereignty of the public was just thrown under the bus, essentially. And the DiEm25 was founded by Janusz Varoufakis, as well as Srećko Horvat and many other leading luminaries, academics, activists, and we've been growing as a social movement and political movement. And our, of course, ideology, if you will, at that time was that Europe needs to democratize within this period of time, 2025, or it will disintegrate. And we've actually seen this, and not necessarily in terms of disintegration practically, but of course in terms of some democratic elements that it had, some of the institutions, etc. And we've seen that more and more. It's becoming an executive-run institution with very little connection to the day-to-day life of its residents and its citizens. And so we've seen this unraveling, and we updated our manifesto, taking into consideration, of course, updated analysis and history. And we clearly have come out and talked about the oligarchy in terms of literally the power of the few, as opposed to democracy, power of the many.
Yes.
And we see that the few are calling the power in, calling the shots in Europe, and of course globally. So This is, if
Great.
you will,
Yeah,
some of the origins of it. And
well, for Dutch speakers, I think we remember Yanis Varoufakis from that time, as he was quite present also in our media with his opposition to the European approach to sort of solving the crisis, which was very much at the cost of Greece. And I think with pain in their memories, also the Greek remember the Dutch, the Dutch delegate at that time, who used to be a minister of finance in the Netherlands, Dijsselbloem, who talked in a very sort of, how do you say, actually he was talking very badly about Greece and about the way Greece was handling its finances, and very in a derogatory way and very sort of top down. So I think the Greeks will remember that this Dutch official with a pain in their hearts. And also I have to say I'm quite ashamed of that episode. And I think that really shows that episode. At that time, I didn't really understand it. I have to be very honest. I knew something was wrong, but how wrong I came to fully understand much later. So to talk about these elementary things, elementary sort of conviction and manifesto of DiEm25, you point to the fact that actually Europe has more and more become an oligarchy. And that you want to democratize that oligarchy.
Definitely, yeah.
Can we shortly talk a little bit about this oligarchy? Because that's something I didn't understand at the moment. Sort of, I kind of believed what media was saying at the time. That the Greeks, they made a mess of their finances, so they should pay back. That was sort of also kind of a mainstream opinion, like the Greeks shouldn't complain because they made a mess of it. So that was sort of common language at that time. How wrong is that language? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can touch on it and also maybe try to link it to maybe the broader scenario at play in Europe, because we see that, and especially that episode, we could see that there's this huge financialization power behind the scenes, working behind the scenes. And that financialization power, if you will, affects if people can afford homes or not, for example. And once again, we see, as an example, you talked about of this issue, was in Berlin, where there was a popular referendum where people wanted and voted for, worked very hard to vote for expropriation of large privately owned flats and apartments. I think by 62%, something like that. But the referendum is not it's an advisory referendum. And what has happened? Nothing. There's been some committee set up. And there again, you can see popular will being put aside. And this was not just expropriation where, the private companies don't get anything. No, this was expropriation with, let's say a well-calculated remuneration exactly for those corporations, for Deutsche Wohning and there's other huge organizations that own thousands of homes in Berlin. And so we see this financialization, huge monopolization of businesses, of services, etc. As part of that, as part of that reduction of the power base away from the public towards the select few. I mean, you also know it in the Netherlands, where there was reports where Prime Minister Rutte would get text messages from the CEO of Unilever regarding a dividend, taxations and things like that. And that was how policy is being made.
And those messages were conveniently deleted also.
Right. So, I mean, the fact that...
And by the way, yesterday I saw an article that the house prices since 1995 have gone fivefold over since 1995. So houses are at an average of 5 times more expensive.
It's ridiculous. And homelessness has quadrupled under the leadership of Prime Minister Rutte and the 4 cabinets.
Under his leadership, a very notorious Minister Blok he openly had a conference with like companies like BlackRock. Is it BlackRock? And those kind of where he afterwards happily stated that the market was now open for business. You'd say that the housing market was open for these investors, and that was a great achievement of their policy.
Yeah. So in a sense, when we talk about the oligarchy, it's this that level of society which sends messages to the prime ministers who then act on it.
Yeah.
It's no longer a popular discussion about something.
It's not the politicians themselves, you say?
Yeah, I mean, the politicians themselves are really also at some level are no longer free to act out of their conscience, in a sense, right? I mean, we see it very clearly with even now with the controversy around Wopke Hoekstra and his nomination. Even within his own party, there's controversy about him being nominated. And I mean, there's no discussion.
There was no parliamentary discussion.
It's a caretaker cabinet, which makes a decision. And, I mean, my bigger concern, after coming maybe back to the question of Ukraine.
Yes.
And this continuing escalation is that my bigger concern is that sending this enormous zero focus on achieving peace or ceasefire in Ukraine. And at the same time, escalating the war with zero public discussion about it and zero even, some of the audience has children. If we are going to be sending eventually Dutch, Belgian, German, whichever nationality soldiers or civilians are going to die from this, we should at least have a referendum on this issue. Are we going to continuously only talk about the military option, or are we also going to at least in parallel pursue a peaceful resolution to the war? And we've seen this before in previous wars. There's always, sometimes if there's a political will towards peace, there is shuttle diplomacy going on, etc. in the background, maybe in that sense, but not the zero. This war will continue until, again, according to the what we see in the media, until the Russians are defeated. Right. So that means what?
Yeah. What's the logic of that? Yeah. What's the ultimate logic of that choice to go for that? Yeah.
And so if this is the decisions that's made by the politicians of the day, especially in the Dutch context as a caretaker government sending all these F-16s, they can't make decisions about accelerating the Toeslag affairs situation because they don't have authority, because they're caretakers. But sending F-16s
they call all the
no
dossiers
problem.
that they can't talk about, they call them controversial.
Yeah.
That's literally the word.
Exactly.
But Ukraine is not controversial, no?
No. And this is the problem, is that these are, we are moving closer and closer to, World War III potential situation, and that's not controversial. And if we're going to do that, at least give the public a choice. And then we can then deal with the consequences, because we've at least we've had a say in it and made a decision about it as the public,
So let me ask you, and maybe you can explain how this fits in with your view of the oligarchy. Like, how did we get in such a situation? Like, I was kind of shocked, and I've said it before in other interviews, that we have sort of a liberal, right-wing liberal government, which is should be in theory like business oriented. So I thought, they won't escalate so far as to undercut their own industry, or their own business with Russia, or their own energy supply, the energy security. But yet every time they've crossed the line, sort of risking it all basically in this gamble to win this war against Ukraine. What is your analysis? How did we get this far down the line that we are now talking about F-16s, and that we have a real prospect of direct war with Russia?
Well, it's a very good question. Some of it has actual, if you will, legal positioning, because issues of foreign policy out of national hands to some extent, especially security, military ones. It's the decisions are made generally in NATO, or at some level through the European Common Security and Defense Mechanism, which is sitting under Joseph Borrell. And this mechanism, it sits from a European Union point of view, is sitting within the Council of Ministers, which is as opaque as a black wall. So the decision making, again, it happens in a non-transparent way, and it's very far removed from the everyday lives of the people. So there's a huge disconnect in terms of policy making when it comes to this, what you mentioned about escalating it, because it's being done around the room with generals and foreign defense ministers with no real authority to go any differently from the official line of the United States. And that it comes down to this, is that Europe is not independent, essentially, when it comes to foreign policy. It has to toe the US line. And to some extent, even, South Korea, Japan, etc., are also in that boat. The moment that we've seen from history, that if there's any tendency towards independent foreign policy, then, if it's not necessary, there's a meeting with, some embassy officials, and if there's no change in policy, then you have a coup d'etat or assassination or something like that. Of course, I'm generalizing.
Well, yeah.
But Europe does not benefit from independent foreign policy. And so as long as the United States' decision is to continue pursuing the war, then Europe will follow suit.
But it has, I see that also, but I'm also I'm sort of shocked by it in a way, because there were times that there was pushback from Europe towards the US. Yeah, as minor as it may seem, like the French, he refused to join the efforts in Iraq. General de Gaulle was very critical. He stepped out of NATO once, I think. Germany had a very independent sort of Ostpolitik, East policy, where they sort of had some sort of understanding of Russian interests, like Willy Brandt, etc. They had a sort of awareness of the risks they were taking when just following NATO orders. Also, the Netherlands, we used to have like stronger leaders that could at some points be critical, as small as it was, but now there seems to be our leaders seems to have become weaker, and there's a total absence of any sort of criticism, it seems. I think Thatcher even refused to sort of join the efforts in Vietnam. Those kind of people we don't really see in Europe nowadays. Do you have an explanation for that?
I mean, it's trying to explain that. It's, we come back to the deep integration in a way of, going back again to the financialized interest, if you will, to the huge hedge funds and the huge corporations that actually own both sides of the Atlantic. It sometimes is the same corporation that has so much interest here. But of course, we can't blame the corporations for everything in that sense. But there's a strong lockstep between, if you will, the Western European continent and the North American continent in terms of foreign policy, economic policy, etc., that we've seen. I mean, if you look at the rate of privatization of hospitals, of etc., even in your own country, and so on. So we tend to be following at a slower rate, of course, the United States. Now, you gave some very great examples, and those are of course true and valid, and they did exist and did happen. And maybe, you know, if you were to sort of put on a ruler, you might say, well, you've had 5 or 8% independence in foreign policy, but the other 92% is very close. And it's very interesting. I mean, we talk about Austria as a military neutral country. Yes and no, because, you know, the Austrians are quite present in Bosnia as part of the EU force. The Common Security Defense Policy Handbook training, etc., happens in Austria, etc. The Swiss arms industry and so on. So there's different layers to this, you know, and at the end of the day, we haven't really seen like a strong response to this. And there is an element as well that, you know, ties back to as well to the public itself. You know, so if at some level the public is also not really that involved in issues, on geopolitical issues, on foreign policy issues, in a sense. So there's, if you were to think about like what is the type of demand from the public on this issue?
But is that true? Because if you see there's have been many movements, like, okay, I was talking about the weakness of current leaders, you know, and they have maybe always have been weak under the American rule, let's say, but then they seem to be weaker than ever, like more following slavishly they say across the Atlantic. But what you also see is that this, yeah, you can maybe call it like chicken or egg. Yeah, you say, okay, the people doesn't demand it, but you can also say the people have sort of already rejected the whole system as it works. They already
there's also that, of course, yeah,
because they don't trust it anymore. If you look to the, you know, whatever reason that, you know, if they're legitimate reasons or not, you see that people express their mistrust. They did it during Corona. You had this whole yellow vests movement in France. You have the farmers' demonstrations.
Yeah,
you see like our leaders are also very unpopular. We are democracies and we are supposed to have leaders that the people have chosen, but they are super unpopular, you see.
Yeah, of course. No, sure. And I mean, you know, there is and will always be and has been movements and strong forces and some social response to this. I mean, when we're talking about the mass of, I mean, if you talk about the Iraq war in 2003, you know, when you had millions coming out on the streets, and that still didn't have an effect, you know, on the actual policy making. And this is when, as you said, people rejected and switch off and focus on their own lives, and withdraw from politics. And so when we talk about democracy from a DiEm25 point of view, it's actually coming back down to making decisions and creating policies from the ground up. And, you know, we, for example, we are really talking about the power of sortition, for example, and deliberative democracy.
Power of what?
Sortition.
What is that?
The use of sortition, of creating citizen assemblies and councils made up of randomly selected members of the public to deliberate and come together and direct policymaking in countries with the parliament, for example. This is just an example, with the parliament acting as a more of a technical adjunct, if you will, in that sense, and bringing citizens back into playing a function in a democracy, instead of just a purely representative democracy mechanism where we just tick a box every few years, in that sense. So I've
understood that if you become member of the party, DiEm, or the movement, then you also get access to sort of a whole host of, let's say, online resources that you can also join and participate in discussions and those kind of things, no?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And a lot of these actual, you know, things I'm talking to you about now, whether it's opposition on Ukraine or deliberative democracy or a future after capitalism, is done by our members through discussions, debates, online groups, etc., voting and so on and so forth. So we actually
just a question, can that not also be sabotaged by sort of infiltration and those kind of things?
What can't be sabotaged, Jakob? But it's a good question. You know, look, we are also guided by a manifesto, and things that are not in the spirit of the manifesto obviously can't be, you know, included, if you will, in that sense. So we still have our principled list of positions, if you will, in that sense. But now how to develop deliberative democracy. How do we improve the rights of workers, our policy of one worker, one share, for example, which is very interesting to discuss and, maybe talking to about in more detail. So these are all developed as an ideas lab within the movement. And then, of course, we published this, we disseminated, we take part in discussions around it as well externally. We will hopefully be at a climate jobs conference in the Netherlands in October as well, talking about our positions. But these are also used by our political parties, which come out of the movement. So the movement is a social movement, and then we have parties in Italy, Greece, and Germany, which will then, of course, if you will, compete with those policies that I just mentioned to you now. In that sense.
Hey, I would like to go back to sort of the analysis of what's going on and how did we come at this point that we are actually at the brink of potentially a very devastating, it's already devastating for the Ukrainians, but it could be even become much, much worse. And the question, how did it get so far? And actually you answered by pointing towards the corporate relations and the weakness of our leaders has to do with sort of that their policies seem to be guided not by what people think, but by what corporations need. No, if I summarize it fairly, I don't know. But what is to be gained? What is the plan then for Ukraine? What is in your view? Why did we go into this conflict so hot-headedly? What is to gain?
Well, to gain for who?
To gain for the guys who want this war.
There was I think a quote a few days ago from a congressman from the United States talking about how, and I'm paraphrasing here, of course we can double check the quotation, but that the fact that this war is really good for the United States, that Russia is getting weaker and there's no American blood.
I think it's Mitt Romney.
Yeah, I think so, yes.
Yeah.
Right? So there's the answer. In that sense. And also, we have to try to see that, look, this decision to actually go to war was still made by the Russian Federation. Right? Yes. Even though there's talks of the provoking expansion of NATO, etc., there really clearly is an aggressor here. In that sense, right? So the decision to go to war was still made by the Russian Federation, and still is a war of aggression.
Yes.
But of course, there's very great analysis about this already. I'm sure you've seen it as well, about the multi-layerness of this. The proxy war aspect of it, the Eastern Ukraine civil war aspect of it, the interstate conflict, and so on. And so it also looks like the Russian situation. And again, it's a bit more difficult to analyze the Russian situation from here because Russian media is banned here. It's very difficult to see the other side, if you will, even though it is the aggressor in this case, to see what their thinking is. And it looks like they're also in for the long haul on this war. And we've noticed that famous graph of the US economy and wars. That doesn't only mean a war economy is not only good for the United States, it's also good for others as well. So sometimes if we see that the Russian Federation is going in for the long haul, and it also enables their national security apparatus to consolidate its position and force through and purge what it needs to, etc., then it's also beneficial for them. And maybe for them, they've also had this realization that, we'll just continue this as we're going very slowly. And the Americans are happy, and the powers that be are happy.
But then we come back to, sorry, for maybe we go in a circle, but then we come back to the Europeans again, because you rightfully say, I think, that some Americans really happy that Russia is bleeding and it doesn't cost the US more than just a couple of weapons and doesn't cost them any men. But I'm quite sure that Scholz and Macron and Rutte, aren't they aware that this is actually really, even if it doesn't escalate to nuclear conflict or whatever, it's already undermining economy and jobs and security in Europe. I mean, it does. How can they not see it? Or
well, I mean, you're also talking about, we mustn't forget the class war that is anyway continuing in Europe.
yeah.
So this, what you mentioned about now, especially the shortage of energy, affordable energy, and so on, the economic situation. I mean, Germany is not in a recession technically.
Yes, the Netherlands also. Yeah,
right.
Netherlands.
So who is this affecting? It's not affecting people living in Blumenthal.
No.
You know, the people that he has on his speed dial are not the people in the painters district in The Hague.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this actually, unfortunately, because there's the class war continues, and the continuation of the war is affecting the working class, is affecting the poorer part of the population.
But isn't it also affecting, in a way, it's also affecting industrial?
Just to help answer your question, because even if you know, if we're talking about our leaders really not thinking about our people and how this is going to affect them, they're not. Unfortunately, they're not. In terms of our people. And so look, the businesses, now you're talking about the commercial interests and how much those are getting up. All right. So then one has to then go back to who is going to lose and who's going to gain.
Yeah.
So maybe ASML is losing because of the sanctions on China.
In China, yeah.
To some extent. But is it a long-term loss? Isn't chip making going to be with AI and the fourth industrial revolution, etc.? It's not going to go out the window. So they're not going to be, losing long-term in that sense. Is this an opportunity for converting certain industries back to the military? I mean, we've seen the French defense budget go up by 30-40%, the famous 100 billion euro German fund, etc. So there's a reconfiguration. I mean, you've seen it even in the Netherlands with huge expansion of vacancies in the defense sector. Yeah. So we're looking at a reconversion of certain parts of industry into the military. You even had the chair of the NATO Military Commission, Dutch general, I forgot his name now. But he talked about, reconversion of industries and the fact that conscription is still on the books in some countries.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So these are maybe sort of counterbalancing, and I'm using a rational headset now. I mean, of course, I disagree with all of this.
Yeah. But you say for let's say for the oligarchy, the destruction of business isn't so bad because the military can profit from that.
Certain other industries benefit, right? So this whole movement of gas now from the Canadian tar sands into Europe, I mean, that's increased by 60%, 70%. I mean, that's a huge new area of business. I mean, there's like lots of examples of this. We have the whole industry situation is reconfiguring in response to this. To the war and the reconfiguration of the global power bases, with the new BRICS, expansion of BRICS, etc. So there's, business isn't quiet.
So, but I ask this because I couldn't see the European interest in all of this, and I can see the American interest because they can also, buy up cheap European companies that are going bankrupt, or European companies go to the US. So I see the US profit, but you say also there's a European profit somehow in this war, which we have to look for in the military industry.
No, I mean, that's one of them. I mean, the profits of the extractive industries are still up, etc. I mean, these European companies are not necessarily dying out here. Of course, the German industry is getting hit quite hard because it was very dependent on cheap energy from Russia. And I'm not talking, of course, we're talking in general now in that sense. But are our leaders thinking about European businesses? Are our leaders thinking about our homeless people, etc.? No. Are they thinking necessarily about how much harm is this doing? Well, I mean, it's a calculation. You might see that then, I don't know, I can't speak on Mark Rutte's behalf, right? And I don't know how he is calculating it, but in their calculation, they can see that there's a net benefit to be gained by this at some level, in that sense, and I don't know what it is, and it doesn't make sense to me either.
No, okay. Then we are on the same level, because I thought you understood it, because I really don't see the people here in Europe who really profit from this. Actually, I see the US guys, and I see us really as vassals in that sense. I can understand all that. But from a European standpoint, it makes very little sense.
It creates a crisis, Jakob. And crisis is also moments where policies that are sitting on the shelf that are unpopular, could be unpopular, or inactive. So there's other benefits that are just not, doesn't have to be economic benefits, that are being able to be pushed through to a public that is under a lot of pressure. I mean,
do you see certain policies that you think the EU would like to implement now, that they see more chance now?
Oh, yeah. I mean, especially in the area of defense and security. I mean, there's this new rapid military force that's getting that's due to come on stream, if you will. I mean, this is the irony that this is all on the website, and there's zero discussion about this. This new military force of 5,000 to 7,000 troops that are going to be directly under the control of Joseph Borrell, in that sense of the military.
I wasn't aware of that.
The military, the new military structure of Europe. I mean, so, and 2025 is when it's supposed to be mostly German and Dutch militaries. There's always two battalion groups worth of EU troops on rotation, on standby. The countries, of course, rotate, but from 2025, it's going to be a permanent 5,000 to 7,000 troops.
Without involvement of NATO?
Without involvement of NATO.
So that's the first European army that's there.
It's like a precursor to it. And
I already know that there was an integration taking place between the Dutch and the German army, but I didn't know this part.
Yeah. So this is the precursor to it, and this is actually happening with, again, zero public discussion, zero public involvement, and especially because, again, foreign policy is sitting. Again, talked about the legality of it within the legal structure of the European Union. It sits within the oversight of the European Union, and that's it.
Okay, so you're convinced that there are people who have their interests in Europe for continuing this war the way it is, although you don't maybe understand all these interests.
Look, there's three types. There's two push factors and maybe one pull factor. The one pull factor is that you can't deviate too much from Uncle Sam.
Yes.
And the one factor is that certain businesses are benefiting, certain industries are benefiting, and these moments of crisis is when political projects can be pushed through that would otherwise be unfeasible.
Okay, let's go then to what DiEm25 or yourself think about this.
Ukraine, right?
About Ukraine,
and our
your position.
So we of course we reacted. Even the days leading up to the invasion, we already had a reaction on our website, expressing our concern. And of course, on the day of invasion, we condemned it and called for immediate ceasefire and return of Russian troops back to their border. And then there was those early few weeks where there was some negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians. And there was, some possibility that this might only be a very short war, and that's it. And of course, there was a famous visit of Boris Johnson, and then we know what happened there, to some extent, of course. Then as a movement, of course, there's a lot of discussion going on in the movement about this internally, as you know, within other left-wing movements and organizations. And we saw that this is going to continue for much longer than what it is, and started working on, as we always do, what is the alternative? What could instead happen? Which is one of the DiEm25 strong points, because we're not only just criticizing what's wrong with the economy or what's wrong with this, but we actually try to come up with alternatives, realistic alternatives that could be implemented.
So can you tell a little bit about that?
So our peace proposal, which was communally developed and voted on, reiterates some of those things that I mentioned earlier on. Of course, immediate ceasefire, negotiations, etc., withdrawal of Russian troops, as well as bringing into our analysis, of course, and into our plan proposal, is the involvement of the major powers and the UN, because we don't think there's any credible peace agreement without the involvement of China, the United States, EU, etc., into this. And of course, looking at we also have to really think about, and just maybe as a side, I'm saying this, really have to think about the future security architecture of Europe.
Yes.
You know, and you mentioned earlier on the question, how did we get here? Was that we never really integrated Russian Federation into the security architecture. And I know that sometimes we think about, oh, this is not possible, how can we integrate, etc., etc. We just have to go back to World War II. And could you imagine somebody in 1940, you and I having this discussion in 1940, imagining that a decade or two later on, there's going to be such level of integration between France and Germany? You know, it would have been impossible. We would have been called mad people, Jakob. Not have been dreamers. We would be sent to the sanitarium immediately. And these are things to actually push through. That, you know, at the end of the day, you know, you can't change geography. And there is the reality of the Russian Federation, as the other countries, as the reality of Middle East, as the reality of North Africa, etc. And this is the situation of Europe. And we can't, as Joseph Borrell says, have our garden and keep the jungle out. You know, it's impossible. So we really have to get past that and start working with our neighboring regions and countries and work towards areas, and, you know, in a co-developed kind of way. In that sense, that's for the good of everybody, and not just good for lining the pockets of the few.
Yes. So that is basically your proposal at this moment. That is ceasefire, of course, the short-term things, and then after that, building as a European security system.
Well, yeah, that's as I mentioned a bit further on down the line. But something interesting in our position that you might not have seen as well is that with the our view is that once there's a negotiation and a peace agreement with the involvement of the UN and Russia, I mean, of course, Russia, Ukraine, China, and the EU, etc., that's the moment when to drop the sanctions against Russia as well. So we also did talk. We have in our earlier, as I mentioned, those timeline, and we also mentioned the use of coercive sanctions as you know, we shouldn't. It's unpopular, etc. And that was our earlier petition.
Yes.
Earlier in the war when this came out.
So. How you say everything the DiEm says is very thoroughly tested and co-written by ordinary people, members. So how do you feel? How much support would it have among the general population? What's your feeling? I mean, you didn't maybe check it really, but do you think that the majority actually supports this point of view?
It's a very interesting question. What does the majority think at the moment in the Netherlands?
Yes.
You know, when I talk to my neighbors, they're very unhappy about the F-16s.
Yes.
They certainly don't agree with the policy of sending. I mean, this is just my neighbors I'm talking about. We don't have an accurate understanding of what's the public's view because we haven't tested it officially. In that sense, there's been no consultation, so it's very difficult to know to answer you truthfully what the public's view will be. We think it's going to be favorable because we think, of course, we would say that we think it's a rational, well thought through proposal. The first one by a non-governmental organization that came out, and that it's it's aiming towards ending the war. Now, we also, when bearing in mind this is a proposal, it doesn't mean that the parties must sit down and negotiate according to what we say. But it's the spirit of it. It's the spirit of getting to a negotiated solution to this.
Yes, an attitude change of attitude.
And I think that the general public is again, because these are like major armaments going to Ukraine. F-16s is a major armament. We're not sending assault rifles. And so the public generally understands well that this is a really major escalation, and I don't think they agree. And of course, people have also felt the war in their pockets. They felt the war with the inflation.
That's also something interesting, because that is, I know that in Great Britain, the cost of living crisis is an issue, but it's not even an issue here. Well, of course, the problem is there.
It's definitely has been an issue. I mean, it's been 20 to 30%. We've felt it as a family.
No. I don't say it's not an issue. It's not. I mean, it is a real issue, but it's not discussed as an issue. I will say.
Yeah, exactly. I'm sorry. I understand you now. Yeah.
Yeah. It's not a topic of political debate.
Oh, it's not. No, of course, it's not. It's
even though the Voedselbanken, they have record numbers of people in need. Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's a caretaker. It's a controversial issue. It's a caretaker system at the moment. We can't discuss it.
Yeah.
But it's unfortunate. It's really unfortunate. In the Netherlands in the 21st century, that this is a issue that can't be discussed.
Yeah. So.
Oh, sorry. Just also to mention, there's a few other things about the peace proposal. That sort of it's a bit more advanced as it compared to just only ceasefire and negotiations, as well as the idea of recognizing Ukraine as a sovereign country, but also militarily neutral country as part of that proposal. We see that as one of the bottlenecks to a lasting peace. Is Ukraine being on one or the other side.
It used to be neutral until 2014.
In that sense. So the moment that, because it's a strategic country, let's assume in a year's time Russia has occupied Kiev and Ukraine is now in the hands of the Russians, it's going to cause problems for Europe as well. The location, the geostrategic position of Ukraine, means that it would be helpful for from a peace point of view. But we also have to tie this up to maybe a larger goal, Jakob, which is gradual global disarmament. We're spending $2.2 trillion now this year. Last year, is according to SIPRI.
Who is we?
Weapons. SIPRI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research. They published the report.
But that's globally.
Globally, yeah.
Yeah.
2.2 trillion dollars on armaments. This is a huge amount of spending for what? And this is the question, for what? Because we see that we have a stalemate in Ukraine with the most advanced weapons on either side. We have a stalemate. Not exactly, of course, I'm exaggerating, but
at this moment, at least.
At this moment, it looks like that. Even a clear example is Afghanistan. You remember American troops at 3 a.m. Escaping from from Afghanistan. The strongest military in the world had to escape. Literally, of course. I mean, so spending so much on military equipment and militarizing our societies is just a waste of resources, waste of money. If all the weapons of the world cannot defeat the Taliban in Afghanistan, what's the use? Huh? And so we see this is very clear. You take any, I'm talking about recent history, maybe 200 years ago, 400 years ago, this would have been possible. But we live in such a globalized, interconnected world. We've evolved, hopefully, in terms of our thinking, to a position where we can actually find peaceful resolutions to political conflict.
Of course, if we want, yes.
If we want, nations don't have to spend so much.
It's very wasteful.
We're not talking about, okay, we'll disarm, and then there's probably a need for like some, at least as an interim way, of some sort of mechanism, to protect against aggressors, etc. I mean, we're still human beings and we have our qualities, of course. But our security architecture globally is written as if the world is 1945, when there was like 52 countries. Now we're sitting with over 200 countries and territories, and so there's also that bigger discussion, and you don't see Europe at all involved in UN reform, Security Council reform, any kind of multilateral new system thinking, nothing.
So it has to come from us, Amir.
It has to come from us.
And that's also why we do this, why you do what you do, and why we do what we do.
Yeah.
So therefore, I'd like to sort of close off somehow. I think I can talk much longer with you, because I'd like to all the issues that you touched upon require much more investigation.
Of course,
but,
yeah.
Actually, what I'd like to do now is like ask ourselves, because you made the sort of the statement about Ukraine as a party, and I asked you whether you think it's going to be popular, and I feel the same thing. No matter whom I talk to, nobody likes war.
Exactly.
Like there are of course these people who are really sort of have associated themselves so much with Ukraine that they really want sort of this fight to continue until you win. But the majority is quite disgusted, and my question is, how do you unify this voice? Because it's not you don't really get space in regular media. Politicians all toe the line of the NATO, so it has to come from us, as I said. So, but how, if we already feel that there is maybe a silent majority that would support an end to this conflict, like peacefully, how do we approach them, and how do we mobilize people? How do you have experience as DiEm25 to do that?
Well, yes, we do. I mean, we actually are a bit more involved as well locally in the Netherlands, especially around the environmental issues with XR, etc. And we've also had some activities in the universities and so on. It's always the $1 million question, and the answer is always generally the same, which is just we have to get out there into the public space and do it. And to build the organization and build that fill that void.
So how are you now building support for your peace plan?
Yeah, so I'll come to that now. So we also to be aware of the roadblocks ahead of it, because the silent majority that is against the war might also be against freedom of movement as well. It might also be quite comfortable with maybe a capitalist means of economy in that sense. So there's always these nuances about the population that we're looking at, that we're working with, in that sense. Unless one has a single party, single idea, which also doesn't help in that sense. So it's always difficult to do, but it's always about going into the public and talking with the public. So that's what we do. We pamphlet, we reach out and talk to members. We grow the movement, of course, as we try to do that, and we try to get our position out into the media, into conferences and so on. But it's a bit difficult.
Well,
with the element of censorship.
Yeah, censorship. But in fact, you've already you can say you've already won the fight in the sense that you feel that there is a majority for what you want. Okay, but like you mentioned something very sort of in very neat words, very careful words. You said there the silent majority might also be against freedom of movement. And if I may make it a bit more explicit, the party in the Netherlands that supports very much, sort of would support, and who has actually quite an accurate view on what's happening in Ukraine, is very much seen as a radical right-wing party. I think it's not so much a failure of. I think it's mainly due to the failure of the left in order to be clear about have a moral point of view about war and peace, etc. So it's more. I see it more as a failure of the left to accommodate this the same feelings which are now expressed by the right-wing parties. How do you deal with that? Because I think it's a trend all across Europe that the parties who are mostly pro-peace now are the sort of radical right movement somehow. You yourself are coming from a more left-wing position. How do you deal with that you actually share a lot of the same points of view, but you find each other opposed in other points of view?
It's such a crazy world.
Yeah.
I was watching the Tucker Carlson and I was like, oh my God. This is
he's absolutely right, isn't he?
He's definitely right on the
but it hurts to say.
But I'm just saying it's very interesting how things have developed. And there's there's also there's this other side comment I can also throw at you, which is that there's pro-peace if you will actors that actually want peace so that the focus moves on to China.
I know.
Right?
But those are mostly in the US, not so much in Europe.
No, sure. I'm just saying that this is how use any explicit you want word. Crazy things have become.
Crazy world,
look, there's some always continuous good news as well on the left. And that happens when we are generally involved in people's lives on a day-to-day basis. So there's lots of examples of the Communist Party in Austria, the Workers' Party in Belgium, etc. Our party in Greece, of course, it's not as big and wasn't able to get as many votes. Of course, we're still quite young, if you will, in that sense. But it actually comes down to being relevant to the public and to the youth. And we can say it's a failure and put our hands up, or we can just continue doing what we need to do.
I will always opt for the second.
Exactly.
But would you stand at the same rally of a right-wing party who actually has exactly the same view as you?
They have come to that same position about the war, but everything else they have not. And it's going to be very complicated to support xenophobic actions and racism and everything else alongside that. No, so I wouldn't necessarily support. It would be interesting. It would be good if one could have a debate and have go to the Bali and have representatives from different organizations.
Can't we organize that, Amir?
We should do it.
Yeah, I think it's Of course, it will be harder to find someone on the left than to find someone on the right to sort of talk.
I mean, there's also the state of the left in Netherlands, etc. One can also talk about that at length, but it's also, unfortunately, there's a bit of losing touch with the base. We've got our collective bargaining agreements, we have our good standard of living, etc., and we've forgotten about internationalism and we've forgotten about solidarity. Those more successful, if you will, if I can use that word, parties in other countries, and of course in Brazil, and of course in other parts of the world, are able to do it by being involved in people's lives. And we're not.
But I think, I'm just now thinking in the interest of peace, and I think it's so strange that sort of there's now two groups for peace. One is right wing, other is left wing, and they don't come together, it's very odd. It's just a very strange situation, and I feel very uncomfortable by it.
Well, it's not about not coming together, right? In that sense, but you will find that even with, say, your center right or your center parties or what you will, there will always be some commonality on some certain positions, but not on the overall line and vision
of society.
And these very few demonstrations that happen in the Netherlands, maybe public displays, are very rare. Those are, moments where, this very smaller segment of society comes into contact with something called politics, and has a chance to maybe have a think about it for a second before they move back onto the Instagram. And so there is that reality of that we have to work with. Now, is it unfortunate that we can't come together and say we agree, let's for peace push for what? You would need to gain political power in the country, 51%. Now, if you have 51% and your only point of agreement is the war, everything else you're going to disagree, it's not going to work.
No, but this war is so essential. It's maybe even, it's a matter of survival. Maybe nobody knows if it escalates towards that point. You can also say, I'm not saying I promote that, but I'm just having these thoughts.
I know. We're just talking. Yeah.
Like if at first, let's just first try to prevent any nuclear escalation first together, and then we talk about our other differences. Somehow, I'm thinking in those kind of terms.
It's very difficult. It's almost impossible.
In
that sense, because the visions are so different, and the very base nature of how should I say this, of what we want to achieve is very different in politically.
But maybe not. Maybe I think maybe yes on the level of party leaders, but on the level of people who vote for these parties, they're easily convinced of what you say about the oligarchy. It's the same thing. What they feel, they could be very open to that. They are, in fact.
So then this is about then actually talking to them, talking to the members of the public and inviting them to participate. In that sense, I'm just saying I can't be a little bit maybe on the cynical side of it, because the moment you look at our policy paper on migration, our second green paper, which is a planet without borders, there's a certain,
that will not be
a certain full stop happens after that first page for some people.
But you know what? But there's something else also going on. That is that because the left is silent on these very crucial issues, even people who have an open heart to the whole world and want a world without borders, they still tend to go to the right wing, because they at least mention peace.
Yeah, of course. There's no credible alternative at the moment. We're not offering anything. We're not. So we have to build that offering, and then hopefully people will come on board.
All right.
I think it's a yes to that conference. At least we can as an outcome for sure.
Let's do that. Maybe before the elections.
Yes.
Let's see. Let's talk about it. Thank you very much, Amir. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you.
Unfortunately, we don't have much more time. We can do another interview maybe later. Thank you very much. I'm very happy that I've talked to you today, and thank you for your insights and introducing DiEm25. Is there a place where people can find you as an organization?
Yes, of course. Yeah, our website, DiEm25.org.
DiEm25.org.
And we have it in available in multiple languages, so that's not a problem.
That's great. Thank you very much, Amir, and see you soon again.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.